Okay, we're live. So welcome to the Node.js Next 10 mini summit on Wasm and security model and related things like profile, security policies and so forth. We had an agenda in the issue, which was, the first 90 minutes to look at Wasm, have a break, then go into the permissions policy security model for 90 minutes, have a break, and then sort of wrap up and capture next steps. Does that sound like, is there anything else we should add to the agenda for that? If not, the one thing that I didn't put on the agenda, but probably makes sense, is for everybody to sort of give a short introduction to who they are and what their interests are in the two topics. So maybe we can kick off by doing that first. And I think I'll do that based on the attendee list, if that's okay. And so, Jarish, you'd be first.
Hi, everybody. I'm Girish. I work for IBM. I'm a Node.js TSC member, as well as work for the diagnostic working group. My main interest is on the permissions, policies, and security model.
Okay, thanks. Ulysses?
Yep. Hello. Yeah, I'm Ulysses. I have been the last couple of years working on some open source tools and evangelizing about security and working close to the security working group. So my interest in the meeting as well will be a lot around the permissions and the security model and all of that.
Sounds good. Luke Wagner.
Hello, I'm Luke Wagner. I work at Fastly on WebAssembly, standards and evolution. Interested in the JavaScript API, Esm Integration, and I work on things like interface types and the component model. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thomas?
Hi, so Thomas, I'm part of the security working group and working with Node.js since 8 years. And like Ulysses, I'm following closely the work around the security. So my main interest is around permission and security model.
Okay, thanks. Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard. I work for Red Hat. I'm on the Node.tsc release and build working groups, and I'm attending to just get a general feel of discussions and see what's sort of coming next.
Sounds good. Rodney.
I'm Rodney Russ. I work at Red Hat as well, and I have a general interest similar to Richard to see what's coming up in both Wasm and on the security side.
That's good. Jean?
Yeah, I'm Jean Burlier. I'm working mainly with Node.js and a bit with Wasm also lately. So I'm quite interested on that part, but also on the security and how we can improve the state of security for Node.js and to help company with that part.
Tobias or Tobias?
Tobias, and I currently work with Cloudflare. I'm on the Node TSC, and I've done some security work for Node, and I've done some work on WebAssembly as well. So I'm kind of interested in both.
Great. Beth?
So hi, everyone. My name's Beth Griggs. I also work at Red Hat, and again, just a general interest in both topics.
Okay. Chenzong? If you're talking, you're on mute. Okay, well, I guess maybe we'll come back. Vladimir?
Hey, everyone, I'm Vladimir de Turkem. I've been doing anything linked to node security for the past few years, so I've got equal interest in all topics today.
Okay, sounds good. And Zhenjiang mentioned, I guess it sounds like he can't, the mic isn't working or something like that. So people can keep an eye for his comments in the chat. We can hopefully relay them across. I think that's everybody. I'm Michael Dawson, active in the community and in the Next 10 effort. So I have an interest in helping, or hoping that we can come up with what's important for us as a project on the Wasm and on the permission security models to ensure our future success. So interested in both of them from that perspective. Okay, so let's start out with Wasm. We pretty much have a blank slate here. Does anybody have any suggestions or things that maybe we should kick off with in terms of what we should discuss on that front? I guess one area we could touch on is like the Wasm support within Node itself, how we think that fits in with the rest of the ecosystem, and where we would see people running, yeah, I guess where it fits into that ecosystem. I've seen at least one tweet where somebody took a look at it and said, hey, the support in Node is good enough. If you're going to run Wasm, you might as well just run it on Node. We could figure out, like, is that our strategy to make Node the best place to run Wasm? How does it fit in with the other options, that kind of stuff. So I don't know if people have any thoughts on that front.
So I haven't run Wasm and Node for a while, but usually it always came down to what are the capabilities of the platform when I compile anything from Wasm to JavaScript. So I hit the wall with threads, I hit the wall with syscalls. And as I said, I'm highly ignorant of the latest updates on that. But I guess one goal would be, how can you take any code base and be confident that you can run that on Node over Wasm without banging your head on the wall? I mean, exaggerating a bit, but that's the process is as smooth as possible, if that makes any sense.
So are there any like challenges and so forth that you're aware of on that front, or?
Not recently, there was the support of threads, but I understood that it was an update in the Wasm specification directly. Maybe Luke knows better than me on that.
Yeah, threads is kind of in an interesting state. So what the core Wasm spec gives you as a host platform is the primitives to do your own threading, to share memory explicitly between workers, and they create instances in each worker that you share the same shared memory, and then using atomics kind of build up from there. What it doesn't give you, but we kind of know we need, and everyone wants, it's just a matter of kind of motivating the core spec work, is an actual instruction inside of core Wasm to actually fork a thread directly, just giving it a function reference. It's like a function pointer. So that way you didn't need to explicitly create this worker, which is a whole separate JS environment, and then like do all this coordination, which is painful in many dimensions. So we know that's necessary. Nobody's currently stepped up to do that work. It has some challenges, like when I spawn this thread, can it, these threads that aren't the original main thread, they clearly can't just call the same JavaScript imports that the main thread can, because then you would have multi-threaded JavaScript. So what do you do? What can these threads do? Can they call nothing? And so there's some interesting design work there, and that's why it's like it's a daunting task that we know we need to do, but nobody's really kind of dove into it just yet. But I think it's just a matter of time before that does rise to the top of the priority queue. I'd be curious to ask, is if you can do threading now in Node.js, is it by creating like a node worker and then post messaging a shared array buffer to it, and then basically doing likewise you do in a browser?
Yeah, that's essentially the only way.
Right.
So one thing I'd be excited for is I know that V8 has an experimental stack switching implementation, so we could. So I've done a bunch of implementations where you can either have a WebAssembly per thread, which is terribly slow in the end, and you kind of waste the entire model behind Node and JavaScript in general is doing as much work in a single thread as possible, which currently with WebAssembly, it doesn't really work that well. Since whenever you have to do any IO, you have to wait for Node's async operations, or you have to use sync functions which block the thread. So there is Asyncify, of course, which rewrites your module to do async work. But it does all these stack unwinding and all that in WebAssembly, so it's terribly slow by a large factor, depending on your stack size and all that, and it takes a bunch of additional memory. And if you don't use it with script, then you have to write all the low-level handling yourself. So if we can get some like stack unwinding or stack switching into Node in a way that's exposed to the application, or maybe not exposed and somehow usable, that would probably be a huge benefit without having to create threads explicitly. So that's probably one of the major pain points when using WebAssembly right now, even in browsers.
Yeah, I think you're totally right about that one, in particular, that this tension between, I want to do a synchronous call, but the thing I need to implement it with on the JavaScript side is async, returning a promise. And so the stack switching proposal specifically meant to address that, where basically I can, without using asyncify, have a synchronous call from Wasm that if a promise is returned, it suspends the stack, takes it off the stack, as if, I just awaited, takes it off the stack, and then when the promise is resolved, it resumes that stack and then returns to it as if it was a synchronous call from the perspective of Wasm. So that's definitely the feature they're working on, and it's kind of an incremental rollout, initially focusing just on the JS API because it's like this high value use case, which is most of the actual implementation work. And then the follow-on would be to add these stack switching primitives into core Wasm so you could do finer grain, like kind of co-routining, like if your language needs that, but JavaScript doesn't. So if y'all have any direct feedback channels to the V8 team and say, yes, we really want this, like I think it'd be help them, increase prioritization of this. Its work is ongoing, and I even think there's a prototype that sort of works, maybe doesn't hit performance objectives, but it's definitely in progress. I would give that feedback of, yes, we really want this, because I think it'll really help that what we were talking about.
Yeah, that would be super helpful, super valuable for Node, and most platforms probably, but especially for Node, where we have to try to do as much work in a thread as possible. And then the other part where we can, that kind of works well with that, where we have to do more on Node side, is the other part is you can do all the, even if you can't do it in a synchronous or in an async way, regardless, you still have to copy a bunch of data between the WebAssembly linear memory section and node memory, or like any JavaScript heap memory. So the more APIs we have that can write to a given buffer or array buffer or a U8 array or any data view, any type array really, that would be very helpful. And that's something that Node can actively improve upon. So not always returning a buffer, but instead allowing APIs to access buffers directly.
And I think you're totally right. That's the trick, is instead of returning a new array buffer, take a view that gets written into. By any chance, I've been kind of thinking about this more recently. Is streaming into or out of WebAssembly memory like a major use case? Are streams a big part of this? Or are we talking about other kinds of APIs that aren't streamy, like, I don't know, well, on the browser you have canvases, but probably not Node?
I wouldn't, streams are kind of worms in Node. I haven't seen many use cases. Streams processing, implementing that in WebAssembly should be possible, and especially then copying data would be a major performance drawback. So it would be super helpful to have like a zero copy approach there. Then again, most of these streams we have are either very much IO bound, so we don't really care much about copying, or they are CPU bound, like the crypto streams and all that, which we don't implement in WebAssembly. So, but yeah, it would certainly help for enabling streaming to have zero copy operations.
So have you seen this BYOB reader proposal? The idea there is the BYOB is for bring your own buffer. So at the moment, it was proposed in a pre-shared array buffer world. You give it an array buffer and it detaches it so it can take it off thread and write into it from some other network thread. And then it gives you roughly the same memory, but wrapped with a new array buffer object back. And then you kind of do this double buffering thing where you read the next chunk while you're processing this chunk. So that's not great for WebAssembly because we don't want to be detaching the buffers that back WebAssembly.memories. But there's an extension that I proposed kind of a while back that folks are taking more seriously now, where when I can do racy writes into memory, which is the story with shared array buffer, then this BYOB buffer, the BOBY reader, could take a view to a shared array buffer and then just write into it racely from the network thread. And so that way I can just like have my linear memory and just pass basically a pointer into it, and it gets written to from whatever network thread. Ideally, as it goes from kernel space into user space, it goes directly into linear memory. And so we're like doing no worse than than the ideal case. So that's a particular, if you want, I can drop a link to that proposal in the GitHub issue in the Wetwig repo.
Would be great.
I'll find that.
Yeah, if you can even add it to the minutes, that would be great.
Okay. Oh, I'll do that. Yeah. Okay. 1 second.
So I guess if we're mentioning, Tobias, that the like copying from Wasm memory to node memory, is that something we need to do work in Node, or is that something that we get through the V8 implementation and need to encourage them to add something like that?
That direction, getting data from WebAssembly to Node is usually simple, since most Node APIs don't work on array buffers, but on buffers or U and 8 arrays. So we can already just create a typed array which views a part of WebAssembly memory. Now, the tricky part with that is that WebAssembly does detach array buffers whenever you resize your memory. So that is a super tricky part. So I believe that's something I came across in the past. Maybe being able to create a view of memory that is valid as long as that part of memory isn't deallocated. So right now, even if you increase the size of your WebAssembly memory, the entire array buffer that represents the WebAssembly memory is detached. So you cannot access any data view as soon as you detach, as soon as your WebAssembly. And that can happen by a single CPU instruction within your WebAssembly code. So as soon as the dynamic allocation, for example, that's added by your libc or whichever runtime you use, as soon as it increases the size of your WebAssembly instance, and all pointers essentially that you have from JavaScript become invalid. So that's the major issue with passing pointers into that to any Node APIs, which is something that we can't do much about, which is something that WebAssembly would have to do something about. But that is still the simpler part. The more complex part is getting data from Node APIs into WebAssembly without having to copy. So that would require Node APIs to accept a buffer where to write data, which some do, like the file IO stuff. That does support that, but many other APIs don't. So many APIs. And it's very non-JavaScript-y to allow these low-level memory routines, essentially. For example, like all the web standards, except from the bring your own buffer implementations now, all the other APIs always allocate new memory and return new array buffers, not even views, just array buffers, which are terrible for, they make it impossible, essentially, to implement zero copy. Yeah, Luke, maybe you have some idea about the about having persistent views on WebAssembly memory that don't get detached?
So the root issue there is with a normal memory, the memory.grow can reallocate, and there tends to be this baked-in assumption that the pointer doesn't move over time. I hand out a pointer, you have to worry about a lot more, use after free, like, deep security problems. So that's why it does this eager detach. However, a workaround is if you make the memory shared, but don't actually share it, just make it shared. What the engine does anyways is it does a max size, it tries to allocate as much as it can from the maximum size of the memory, and it doesn't map in, it unmaps most of it, and then it only maps in like the section that you've grown. So when you grow, it just maps in more memory, it never reallocs, because realloc in a multi-thread scenario would be crazy anyway. So because of that, and because of racy grow, views are stable to a shared memory. They don't become detached when you do a memory.grow. They just stay valid for the subset they're pointing into. So that could be a short-term kind of hack, is just make the memory shared. Maybe that's not the best solution.
It still makes a lot of sense. The other problem I usually face is as soon as you try to cross-compile some C code, some library, some application to WebAssembly and then run that in the browser or in Node on any runtime, you usually have to allocate some memory. You can expose the malloc function. You can do all the memory in JavaScript, but then you kind of have the discrepancy between the JavaScript garbage collection and the low-level memory management in the C implementation essentially in your WebAssembly module. So it would be like, ideally, it might be good to have like a memory typed array, some view of your WebAssembly memory, whose garbage collector kind of calls back. I know that's probably completely unrealistic. Just semantically, it would be great to have like some automatic deallocation in WebAssembly when the JavaScript and maybe the existing garbage collection proposals for WebAssembly cover some of that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the Wasm GC will help for the languages that can target Wasm GC because they just integrate with the GC. But even with linear memory languages, there's, I think now, standard, and I think even implemented V8, there's this finalization, I forget what it's called, what ended up being called group. So this is a thing you'd want to use like a glue code generator to do for you, but you can, when you hand out an object that is like a view onto WebAssembly memory, you would register like a finalizer to be called when this object becomes unreachable, and then you use that to call free. And you can get into subtle, if you're unfortunate, like get cyclic situations where the cycle is accidentally rooted. So you have to be kind of careful with this thing, but for kind of the simple case of like, I've got this array of WASM memory, I want to expose it to JavaScript and free it when the JavaScript, when the wrapper objects deleted the finalization feature or finalization group or whatever it's called, I think would be what you want.
Yeah, that sounds like it would solve the problem. So not something we'd have to do in Node specifically.
Yeah, I think that'd be a V8 feature.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering, maybe like we can start by talking about some of the, or we can talk about some of the fundamental questions, like, one, the assumption I have anyway, and it's probably good to always validate, is like us continuing to make sure that Node supports Wasm and lets you run Wasm as part of applications is important, right? Anybody thoughts, questions, like on that side of things? If everybody agrees with that, then it's like, are there additional components that it's important that we include in Node to support that? So for example, the WASI, right, is one of the components that, we have pulled in and we have an implementation. I assume that's also an important part of our, the Node story in terms of Wasm support.
Yeah, on that end, it's probably still web standards, especially with WebAssembly. It's probably important for Node to try to influence WASI specifically to make sure it also works for server runtimes, because we've seen so many standards that work great in browsers, but not really in Node or any server runtime. So we should probably try to actively see that WASI develops into a direction that we can support in Node, and that doesn't just work in browsers.
Okay, that's a good point. So not only is it an important area, but it's an important area that we actually try and influence and stay on top of. And okay, any other bits, like additional standards or specs or something that are like that we should have on our radar and should be thinking about?
Well, if I may plug my own thing that I'm working on, there's a little cluster of standards that have kind of been renamed over time, and also recently 2 of them just got merged. Previously, you might have heard of interface types and module linking. They've recently kind of been fused into one kind of new proposal, which is a layered spec that's like on top of Wasm. So it's not changing core Wasm, but adding a thing on top, called the component model. And the idea is to try to be able to give Wasm high-level type signatures instead of kind of this low-level thing where it's all like arrays of bytes and I32s, but kind of describe high-level types like lists of strings. The idea is it's polyfillable in terms of core Wasm, so you can take a component binary and spit out a core module that's wrapped with JS glue code or Python glue code or whatever language glue code. So that would be like the initial kind of way people would practically use it. But the idea is that both, JS engines could natively implement components, and then just in the way that today Wasm modules have an automatic JS binding, it's like a low-level one of like numbers get coerced to I32s and like big ints get converted to I64s and back. That same JS API could also understand these high-level types of components, and so do coercions between like a JavaScript string and the interface type string there, go back and forth. And what that would do is automatically copy into and out of the linear memory in kind of an optimized sort of way. So yeah, initially it would be implemented by polyfill, and even some folks already have working kind of JS polyfills. If you've seen Rust's Wasm bindgen, it currently lets you use high-level Rust types, and it generates JS glue code wrapper that ultimately wraps up your Wasm as an ESM. So you can just import it. The goal is that it could in the future spit out a component, and you would write the same import statement and it would just work. So there's a native implementation of the bindings for components, and also Esm integration for components should make them kind of feel like ES modules, but without the glue code. It would just be, I'm just directly importing that module. So that's, we're actively kind of prototyping this in Wasm time and in the polyfills and a bunch of related tools for producing and consuming and polyfilling them. But as it moves a little farther along this year, it might be interesting to look at maybe taking just even the polyfills and using that to implement prototype support, experimental prototype support in Node would be maybe an interesting thing. But hopefully it would make the experience of using Wasm from JavaScript, just a whole lot easier and less, less glue code and less machinery to worry about.
Right. I guess, does that bring us, we've had long time discussion. I don't know, it's like more than 5 years about Wasm and native add-ons. And, typically the challenge has been around the types, and that, with only the basic types, there's only so much you can do. So Wasm hasn't been like, okay, we write our add-ons in Wasm. Is this something that helps move the needle on that front?
Yeah, I think that's a great point that I totally forgot about. Yeah, this would be using Wasm to avoid kind of the challenges of native modules, all the native code challenges. Yeah, so these components could be thought of as kind of native modules, but not like kind of node specific. You could take one and drop it also in a browser. So, in any case, you take this, whatever C code, compile it down to a component, and then just import it. And it's just an import statement. It doesn't need a special native module, anything. It's just if you implement components, then you have this thing. So yeah, that is a way to help. And then the idea is people are producing these components for a variety of reasons. Maybe they wanted to use it in Python, or they wanted to use it in JavaScript or in Lua, or I don't know. So in theory, you have more people producing these things than just exclusively targeting Node native modules. So it can maybe access a wider set of compiled code.
Right, and does it handle there's sort of the two aspects of that. One is I want to make a call, and then sometimes the native code that's running wants to interact with JavaScript the other way. Does it have something on that front as well?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, that's right. So these components, like Wasm modules, have imports, and so you could import a function from JavaScript and then call it like as a callback effectively. The high-level types currently that we're sketching would include both future and stream types that would, by design, bind to promise and readable stream. And this Byob stream I was mentioning earlier would also integrate. So when you import one of these components and it returns a future in its kind of abstract high-level type, you would just get a promise that popped out, so you could just await it without any extra glue code. That's one of the kind of design goals. We actually have a worked out sketch of how this should work. We haven't quite fully prototyped it, but as soon as we do, we'll share.
Okay, so that's an interesting one to keep an eye on.
Since you brought up comparing it to native add-ons, which of course is a huge topic, since there are kind of certain categories that native add-ons fall into, and Wasm has been a great replacement, where it's essentially just about porting C code that you want to use a Node or some Rust code or some other language that you can compile. The other parts where performance matters, and then usually native add-ons, of course, still beat WebAssembly in many cases by a small or large margin, depending on what you're doing. And then again, the other part of native add-ons that we see are essentially exposing hardware features or certain operating system features, which we don't expect to see in WebAssembly. So really the main use case has been performance critical code, making it at least faster than JavaScript, even if not faster than a native add-on, which is very slow to call into, by the way. So if you call into a native add-on, that call alone takes up so much time that sometimes, even if WebAssembly itself is slower, you can still call into WebAssembly much faster than into the native add-on. So for small operations, WebAssembly is still much faster. And so there are some native add-ons that we don't expect to replace, especially in like the close to hardware or anything hardware accelerated. I know we do have like the Esm proposals and all that that have been merged, I believe. So there's definitely a path forward for that. And maybe even for like crypto, there is a WASM proposal to use hardware acceleration there. And maybe we'll have constant time WebAssembly in the future at some point, so we can implement other cryptographic algorithms. From the other side, when a package author wants to publish a native add-on, they essentially have to write a configuration file that tells Node, how to, or it tells NPM how to compile their package locally on the machine of the user. Whereas with WebAssembly, since it's portable, we have a huge advantage that the author can just compile it once when they publish it. And so the WebAssembly module is uploaded to NPM in a compiled format, and then your runtime takes it and just compiles it for your local CPU and operating system. And maybe that is something where Node could look if we can make any improvements. We have integrated most of the we have good tutorials on the Node add-on API and how to use it to compile your native add-ons as an author, as a package author. And maybe we can try to ramp up on the WebAssembly side of that, so that package authors have a simple starting point for embedding WebAssembly modules in their NPM packages. Since I've done that a couple of times with different packages, and usually it turned out to be some mix of mscripting or just using Clang directly. And so just some starting point as minimal as possible might be a good thing for us to have.
Okay, so that's something that's not necessarily easy to say, okay, I want to write a module in Node. How do I do that? So you're suggesting a doc or a getting started doc somewhere would be helpful on that front.
Yeah, maybe just an our documentation, or maybe some tooling, maybe something that NPM could do. I'm not quite sure yet. Just an idea.
Out of curiosity, what right now is the state of the art for how you physically, like if you have some glue code that wraps the Wasm, as is usually the case if you're publishing a package, how does that JS glue code get the Wasm module? I've heard people like base64 encode them in strings, and then there's that route. Is there something else?
Yeah, the base64 thing, I believe, is mostly browser's fault for not having a proper way of including other files. So in Node, you can, of course, load it through the file system APIs if you have it as a separate file. You can fetch it from an online resource, whatever you'd like to do. And there are some efforts on integrating it with the ES modules, so you can import WebAssembly modules. Yeah, so that's certainly important. It might just make the requirements. It kind of does depend on WASI being properly set up. If you assume your application can do anything. So with ES modules, from my point of view, the main issue is imports to WebAssembly. So if that's something non-standard, that becomes a huge issue. And I have no idea if Node is in a position to do anything about that, or if it is a problem. But to answer your original question, I believe the base64 encoding is mostly because of browsers. And now with fetch and browser, so in web pages, I usually just use fetch and then instantiate streaming. I am not sure if we even have the streaming interfaces yet, and that is a major issue in Node. So if we don't, well, it's not a major issue since your WebAssembly usually comes from a local file, but still something. Now that we have web streams, and fetch, we might be able to have the streaming WebAssembly APIs as well.
Cool. You mentioned when you're talking about Esm integration, did I hear right there? You're saying like how the imports, when you use Esm integration, how the imports of that Wasm module get satisfied is tricky.
Precisely.
And is it because normally Wasm imports are like these low level, again, I32s all over the place. You need this wrapper, and so you have to somehow inject the wrapper around whatever other functionality it might have wanted to import, and that's a problem?
From my point of view, yeah, but I haven't used it in a while, so I couldn't say if something changed about that.
Yeah, I think that is a real problem. So I would agree. And so there's a variation on the original Esm integration proposal from Guy Bedford and someone else he's working with, where the thing you're importing isn't the fully instantiated module, which means that where the imports have already been satisfied by the Esm loader, which is where things get kind of harder when you need to inject this glue code. But rather what you import is you get a WebAssembly.module object, which is the uninstantiated code. So what you're using the Esm loader is to find that file and get it for you and let that process be kind of declarative and using the normal Esm machinery. But then you get to instantiate it yourself from your wrapper script. So usually if you have WebAssembly.module, now you have all the power to like call WebAssembly.instantiate and precisely assemble that import object that does all the wrapping. And so this variation on Esm integration, I think, is perhaps the more valuable in the short-term one, because it lets you take avoid the fetch / base64 / all that kind of goo, which is like, none of them seem like the optimal answer, especially if you're trying to write isomorphic code that runs both in the browser and Node, and say, okay, we'll just use ESM for that, the fetching of it and the decoding and the compiling, but the instantiation still gets to be done kind of via the imperative JavaScript API. So I think that might be relevant for y'all.
That certainly sounds relevant, and it does solve the problem at hand. And I haven't looked into that, so I might be wrongfully concerned that it seems kind of inconsistent with the way we import JavaScript, since then the instances are local to the module that's importing it, right? Whereas with ES modules, you kind of global state, regardless of your opinion on global state, you kind of global state, and you only have one instance of that module. Similar to like require a node also caches your module, so you don't have multiple instances. So it just seems somewhat inconsistent, but also like a good solution as compared to importing the entire instance.
Yeah, I think the current proposal, which I'll link in the minutes, let's put it here and figure out exactly what to put it in a sec, requires actually a different syntactic annotation in, like, you know, that curly brace import assertion thing. So you're kind of opting into this different behavior is one part. And then the caching mechanism would cache the WebAssembly.module. So it is caching a thing, but what it's caching is this immutable code as opposed to like the live like instance with all the memory. So yeah, that's a good point. It is slightly more regular, which is why we started by default with the other idea, but then it was just like, nobody can actually use this thing. So
yeah, that is probably something that Node itself can't do a lot about. So we'll just have to wait for the ES integration spec to move forward.
Right. So we were kind of talking about APIs. I wonder if we could put together a list of, like, you know, the key APIs that we maybe a current view of, like, key APIs today for Node to be implementing, both, you know, ones we have or haven't. So I think WASI is one that I'm aware of. I think, Luke, you've now mentioned this, what would I call this, component API?
Component model. I can link to
API
that
model. Are there other APIs like that that?
Yeah, the streaming APIs for WebAssembly. Now that we have web streams and fetch, I think it makes sense to have those, which are mostly provided by V8. We just have to kind of enable embedder support for streams, so that then V8 will automatically expose these streaming APIs as soon as we do that.
Okay. Right. So kind of like WASI, there's some things we have to implement, and then you can use the. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Once web streams aren't as slow in Node, it might actually be beneficial.
Right. Okay. But it's good to have a list of, like, okay, if people are like, hey, what should I be doing? And I'm interested in working on Wasm. Here's the, you know, this is part of the list of what we think is important from the what's all out there. Any other ones come to mind? Okay, so if not on that front, I'm wondering now, like, maybe we could write down or, you know, discuss what we think our Wasm strategy is, right? So I think, you know, there's the base sort of functionality, which is just we get Wasm itself from V8, right? And I don't think there's anything we need to do on that. Like, on that front, we just, I guess, wait to, maybe there's some things we would want to influence to prioritize there. But otherwise, it's like, you know, we get the new Wasm features. We'll have a great implementation of Wasm through that channel across our platforms. So there's not anything we necessarily have to actively do. Is that a reasonable viewpoint?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, so we've got that base function now. We kind of get that for free. It just motivates us to make sure, like, hey, it's not another one of the reasons we want to keep getting a new version of V8 because it helps us on that front. The next part would be like then key API support. And under that, we've got that list of, we need to, so it's kind of like enable, part of the strategy part is like enable key APIs that are not part of the base. Was it to say, are they like on top of Wasm? Like is Wasm on top of or supporting? What's the right terminology for that?
On top of or complementing?
Okay, so maybe complementing, key complementing API, complementing. And today that list looks like what we talked about above. Then it seems to me like some of the discussion has been around how we load WebAssembly, like, and I guess, one of the is it kind of like part of our strategy would be make it as easy as possible to load WebAssembly? Because that seems like something that we don't get for free, right? Like that's part of what the platform has to help. Is that right? Or is it just that, we need to document the standard ways of doing that and they're the same for other places, just, some documentation on how you would do that in Node is helpful. I guess like we had the earlier suggestion of some getting started doc.
Yeah, we have a small page on node.js.dev. But maybe we can add up more. Sorry, I cut someone's.
Do you have a link? You said there's an existing page there?
Yeah, let me just link that in the chat.
Okay, so I can add that in the. I think things like, the build process, the compile process, is there anything that we need to do in Node, or is that strictly like we use the core APIs that come from, the implementation we get in V8 and just say, okay, we've got the string of bytes, let's load it. Is there anything that we need or have done around like caching or?
Regarding compilation, I think one thing that's not necessarily clear is if you write your package.json file, how to best integrate WebAssembly compilation into that. So as like a pre-published step or as a separate build step or something you might want. So that might be useful to have at least examples, if not a tutorial, for properly setting that up. Then again, since we don't really have a WebAssembly workflow, so we have our own tool, GYP, for compiling native modules, and we don't really have our own tools for WebAssembly, which isn't a problem. I'm all in favor of using standard tools and not building our own for Node again, or adopting a tool that's going to be abandoned by Google again. But the important part there is probably that at least I usually end up writing a makefile that runs on Linux to compile the WebAssembly code, and then I invoke that from my package.json, which isn't really platform. It doesn't really work on Windows or anything. So, which I don't mind since I'm only going to publish it from Linux. But having some platform independent way of doing that without having to like install CMake or some other complex tool might be useful.
Right. So this is tooling. This is not like in the, and when we say compilation, we mean the compilation from like C into WebAssembly itself, right?
Right. Yeah. It's not as important for WebAssembly as it is for native add-ons, since only the package author has to do it before publishing it. But still helping people get started with that. So again, at least documentation or tutorial would be good with precise build steps. And there are, with WebAssembly, I feel like always there are 10 options and 7 are bad for non-obvious reasons. And it would be great to have some best practices.
Right. Okay. So some tutorial or pointers on how to compile your WASM so that it's in the first place, right?
Yeah, especially in combination with the usual NPM workflow, how you publish a package. So how to make sure it's actually compiled in your published package.
Okay. I wonder, one thing that's come up for us is, you know, open source and a lot of distributions, it's important to have the source code. So just bundling in a hex encoded or an encoded blob runs afoul of some of those. So I don't know if that's something that there's been any discussion on, like how you integrate it into your other repos to address those kinds of concerns.
Sorry, to clarify, is your concern shipping compiled code as opposed to source code?
Right, like, you know, we had at least one comment in the when we pulled in Indici, which uses WebAssembly, and it was like, it's just an opaque encoded WASM, and you know the requirements, I think it was for Susie, who the person was from, was like, we need to have the source code as part of what we ship versus like it. I think it comes back to like, it needs to be the preferred editable source. So, you know, whatever you're going to go and make a change in, you need to have along with what you're actually going to run. And that's what needs to be distributed. So if they're going to, you know, for example, if we pull it into Node and a Linux distro wants to ship Node, they're likely going to have to figure out, well, okay, how do I rebuild that WebAssembly? And if I wanted to make changes in that WebAssembly, how would I do that? And you know, what's the process for doing that? So I wonder if that's something that other people are sort of seeing, because my take is we're going to see more and more of, like, you know, Topias has mentioned, like, say for performance, you want to take a little bit of code, you want to put into WebAssembly, you avoid the crossing boundaries. It's the build process itself is heavy enough that actually just like purely integrating to your build may not happen all the time. But then it, you know, just putting the bytes in causes grief for some people, at least in this other way. So I don't know if like it's not necessarily strictly Node's issue, but we might come up with some guidance about like how to bundle or build to work around that issue if people think it's an issue.
I think it's also not an issue that's specific to WebAssembly. Even for JavaScript, we've had, I feel like, decades of people minifying their JavaScript, uglifying it just to make it a bit smaller, so it takes a bit less space, it loads a little bit faster. So we have had the same problem even with JavaScript, I believe.
Right. Yeah, that is true. Okay, so let's flip back to just the general, like if we have a if we had our Wasm strategy, I think it'd be nice to write that down in our contributing guidelines. And so the components we've got so far is like, we get our base Wasm functionality through V8. Great. We just, you know, need to continue to update because that'll give us newer versions. We need to implement key APIs, which we can keep a list of. We've got the WASI component model and streaming APIs as the ones that people have mentioned that are probably most important now. And then the next part would be, you know, around loading. We need to do something to make it as easy as possible to load and use Wasm. And I guess so far there, we kind of have we should have some getting started. So it's maybe not that we need any APIs or anything, but it's like, here's a resource for how you could get started with doing it. I think it was mentioned that, a tutorial point around how to compile your Wasm and how to integrate into an NPM workflow along with your package JSON. I think those two kind of go together. Would be a part of that strategy. Anything else that kind of fits into that, for us to make it, that's important for Node to be doing to make it easier to use Wasm with Node on the loading front?
The only other thing that comes to mind is the ES modules integration, but that's really fast to implement, but not fast to specify, since there's standard work around that, I believe, Luke. And so it's really just fast to implement. I believe we've made some progress on that. I'm not quite sure what the status is, but yeah, fast to implement, not fast to design.
So sorry, you said first to implement?
Yeah, we'll have to implement it, or we are
Okay.
in the process of implementing it, but we don't have to design it.
Right. Okay. Okay, but that's a key thing to. Does that kind of fall into our key API support list, or is that different?
I think it's more. It's not a separate API. It's more or less a language feature, I'd say, being able to import WebAssembly. So it kind of falls into the load Wasm.
Okay, so but maybe that's one of the top things is like, if that, as that gets defined and implemented, it makes it easier and easier to just require a module, right? Okay. And that's kind of the primary way we see of Wasm being consumed. We don't need to do the equivalent on the require side.
It might solve the problem that Luke was talking about embedding base 64 encoded WebAssembly into your JavaScript file. So if you can import them in Node and in browsers, we are kind of going to get rid of that and actually decrease the size, since it can just be a binary file then.
Right. Okay, but that's our key strat. We don't think it's important to do anything else. Like if we say ESM is the way you would import those, nobody's going to complain, or we don't think the require side of things needs an equivalent.
I'm not so sure about that. Maybe I mean, if you're willing to use node specific things like require, you can also load it through FS, since you're not really going to benefit much from using require, I believe, aside from maybe caching it. But V8 internally also caches our compiled WebAssembly modules, so we aren't too concerned about compilation times if we don't cache it. Yeah, so maybe we might want to have an equivalent for require, but I don't think it's urgent. It's going to be node specific anyway, so, and we have ways in Node to do that.
Okay. I'm just thinking like strategy wise, what would we want to say? Certainly you're saying the ES one is the top priority, right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, and so V8, in terms of the loading time, or the compilation time for when you load the module the first time, is that anything Node should be doing anything about, or like caching and all that kind of stuff fits in the back in the?
Yeah, Michael, you and I worked on that for a while, yep. And we could certainly implement some kind of caching for WebAssembly code beyond the current. So V8 will cache it within your process, but for like large scale server setups, that might not be enough. So we could definitely go beyond that and cache code beyond that, which V8 will facilitate for us in some ways as soon as we use streaming APIs. So V8 kind of caches only if you use streaming APIs. There are ways around that, and we have implemented some of that. Not Node, of course. The only question is essentially where would we store compiled code? It's a security concern, of course, storing any form of compiled code. We could also cache compiled JavaScript code. Theoretically, there is academic work on that. And it would definitely help with startup times. But again, the main question is where would we put compiled code in a way that we can trust and audit?
Right. So maybe it's fair to say that, like, is it fair to say, like, is loading time an issue in general today? Or is it like something where today it's not, but we think it might become an issue as more Wasm is used? Just
So server runtimes, it's not a terribly big concern, since even if you use it in different threads, it should be cached already. But if you're trying to go into like a serverless environment, if you try to do anything like that using Node, then you might run into situations where the startup time. I've seen WebAssembly modules on the wild that are dozens of megabytes of code, and loading those, the startup time is going to be affected in terrible ways. And yeah, again, the streaming compilation might help with that, especially since the way V8 compiles a code, your startup time mostly depends on V8's tearing up compilation. So if you try to just synchronously compile your code, V8 will tear up differently than if you use the streaming APIs, for example. So V8 will try to optimize internally, but due to the lack of streaming APIs, we aren't really utilizing all that well.
okay. So it's an area where we might, like, improvements could be made, but it's not something that's like burning, you know, it's not going to define the success or failure of Node as a platform for running Wasm or anything like that.
It's a small concern. There are, of course, huge benefits here, at least theoretical benefits, or well, theoretical is the wrong word. There are guaranteed benefits from caching code, but the security risks are difficult to mitigate for us as a platform. It's much easier for the actual users, the actual developers, to define their own caching mechanisms probably. And yeah, it's something we can facilitate. We can make it simpler for people to benefit from that, but it's 99% of it is done in V8.
Right. Okay. I'm just taking a quick look at our time. I think we still have time. We start at 10, so we've done about 65 minutes. We can still have a 10, 15 minutes. Any other in terms of Wasm? So we've got the, I think the three things: the base functioning through V8, key API support, make it easy to load Wasm. Anything else that we think is like should be on a list of like, hey, our strategy includes these things?
One thing that should be on our list, I believe, is making sure that Node or our own APIs are compatible with the WebAssembly, so they can be called efficiently. And async functions are probably going to be solved by the WebAssembly specs, the work that Luke talked about earlier, so that we can use stack switching and all those fancy techniques to efficiently call async functions. But we also have all the copying around, so all the APIs that currently allocate new buffers could be more efficient when called from WebAssembly if they could simply write into WebAssembly Memory directly. So in one sentence, I think we should make sure that our APIs are compatible with WebAssembly and can be called efficiently.
Okay. I assume, is there like a short list of things that we should capture for what that means in terms of what we should do?
It might, since again, it doesn't feel very JavaScripty to do all that low-level memory stuff, allowing people to pass in their own pointers essentially. So it's not something that many Node APIs provide, except a few that are very critical for performance. We could definitely revisit most APIs that deal with data input and output and see if we can allow buffers to be passed in, or any type error really. Yeah, there's really not much beyond going through all of our APIs and seeing if we can improve them.
Right. So it's basically, I think, like it's reviewing the APIs and maybe identifying like what are the key ones we think would be most likely to be used in Wasm. And then for those, it's like considering then it's like additions to allow a pre-existing buffer or handle to a buffer or something.
Yeah, that's the main concern, copying around data. I believe all the other data type conversions are kind of covered by the interface types proposal, like string to WebAssembly memory, for example.
Okay.
Maybe I'm misremembering, but I believe that's covered by existing proposals.
Okay. So basically it's like, okay, yeah, the data. So this is around to avoid data copies, right?
Yep. Especially with like streaming that Luke talked about, it would be great to not only have the bring your own buffer stream and the web standards, but also compatible APIs in Node.
Okay, so that's a good one. It's sort of like it's a if we sort of document that that's something we think would be strategic, it could at least give some people some backing to say, this is useful work, and if there's PRs that do that, have a the background as to why they make sense.
Yep.
Any other things like that? Is there any reasons today why people would say don't run your WebAssembly on Node? I know, Luke, there's other runtimes. What would the other runtimes say? Like, hey, major advantage over Node using WebAssembly on Node are there like some ones that come immediately to mind, or?
I think there'd be a reason against. So just if you don't additionally need a native JavaScript engine and you just wanted the Wasm, that would be
okay. So it's not a limitation side of things. It's more just like don't include things you don't need, right? Any other thoughts or things that we think that people are like, hey, we should talk about on the Wasm front? I think we've had enough of a discussion that like I can write up a doc for our contributing, like we have a doc contributor section, and we could have like a maintaining Wasm section, and we can put this strategy in there and sort of build on it and add some more stuff. But this is we've had a good enough discussion to sort of lay that out, I think, which is good. So if we don't have any other thoughts on that front, maybe I'd propose we take like, a 15-minute break now, and then we can come back for the next section. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, great. So I'll let the stream keep going, but I'll mute, and I'll see everybody back at 11:25. Good, okay. No? Oh, there we go. So good, it's good to see the guy. I tried to promote you earlier, but no, I'm just gonna close my door. I'm not sure if everybody's back, but it is 11:27, so we should probably get going. Okay. Let's see. Right. So permissions, policies, security model. Again, we're starting with the blank space. So I don't know if people have thoughts in terms of, where we should get started. What are some of the key topics we should discuss? Oh, I see somebody has their hand up. Let me flip back to there. So Ulysses.
Yeah, I have done some checks prior to the meeting in terms of looking the previous records about the topic and some pull requests made in the past. So maybe I can provide some context, but maybe I'm not the most updated one. So I don't know if anyone else has a.
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, checking the.
So go ahead, but I just have to go on mute for a second. Sorry.
Okay. So yeah, checking the prior meetings, I think the first, or at least the first mention that I know about the security policies in terms of for this meeting was in August this summer. So I think was a long discussion with some TCC members about the objective for the next 10 years, right? And one of them is this one about the security policies. I think the agreement on that meeting was more or less to go ahead with the idea of, deploy some kind of policies. I think the big question there is how this should be, how the system might look like in terms of how this is going to be approachable for the users, if it's going to be a breaking change or not, all of that big concerns. I think also Tierney as well had some concerns on the time regarding on how this might affect as well the distributions of Node.js, if we need to have a special distribution with this kind of policies enabled by default or not. So in terms of that, I think is going to be like the kickoff for this meeting. In terms of what happened, just having a more open view the last years, I think we had Deno as a reference, maybe that we can start to look for maybe a policy system in place that can be maybe similar, the one that we might build at the end. And what they have in scope, I think, in terms of what they control with the policy, I think it's the environmental variables, the file system, how you manage if you allow Node to run in subprocesses, and also a lot regarding the network accesses. I think they have also some specific to Deno, but I'm not very sure on that. And as well, I think there's a lot of work done by the community before and also by some of the core contributors of Node, especially from Anna, I think, Anna Henningsen. I think she created a pull request time ago with some kind of a proposal for the security model. And then I think there is also a very interesting blog by James, who could not join the meeting at the end. He put in the notes, but with a lot of research, on this topic. So we might also use that as part of the kickoff, discussion, which as well has a proposal in terms of pull requests. I will put also the links on the meeting notes, but one of the things he was mentioned on the blog, which I think is interesting, is in most of the cases, a lot of people use Node.js in the context of containers, like Kubernetes and Docker environment and all of that. So that way you can have a lot of control of what's going on, with the application, but maybe not if you are using Electron, or maybe not if you are using, just a simple server with Node.js running. So For those kind of a scenario, this policy might have a lot of sense. So that's fully okay. Also, I think it's important to control third-party modules, you know, have a lot of node modules normally that we include, that they has full access to many things that maybe we don't want to. So that can be one of the key things. But yeah, it's true that we can have a lot of breaking changes potentially, you know, that may affect the way how we use Node as end users, you know, in terms of creating applications and all of that. And yeah, I think also we need to have a very, very long, well, maybe not very long, but really conceived discussion about what's going to be, for example, the way to, you know, deal with the granularity. Do we want to have like enable access, remove access, or we want to have more granular? We want to split between the application process itself and the node modules, or we want to have a more advanced and more simple system, you know? So I think it's going to be, for me, it's like 3 different things around this topic. One is like having a good discussion on what is going to be the architectural approach and what's going to be like the decisions to be made, you know, in terms of granularity, how to deal with dependencies, all of that, having a good plan that everybody more or less in abstract light and like it, and then we can move ahead, you know, in terms of how feasible is that in terms of the Node.js core, because I think it's going to be a big change. So obviously it's good that it's part of the, you know, 10 years Byob strategy, because it's going to take a while until it's in production. And as well as a side thing that we can do in the meantime, maybe potentially, you know, is maybe documenting or providing some advice, you know, to Node.js users on how to, you know, properly Dockerize and, you know, put control boundaries in terms of file system, networking, and all of that in, you know, Kubernetes environments or any other environments. So the people in the meantime can have, you know, growing the feeling and security of Node still to be a very secure system, although we don't have yet this, you know, security system in place, which they might be looking in comparison with Zeno, which was the, I think, the original kickoff of the last discussion. Yeah. What do you think about it? Well, maybe too many things together, but
I think that gives a lot of the history. You know, a couple 2 cents I'll add in is that, you know, there has been some work that has gone in. I think the main discussion from like the, you know, we did have a summit a while back on the policy side is that it's almost impossible to build something which actually is like 100%. And it's so, you know, we in the last one, we had lots and lots of discussion about, well, can you, if you, it usually came down to like, well, there's some way to get around that, or you end up having to turn them all on, or so it's the, does it need to be perfect to be useful? And if it needs to be perfect, there were lots of people who would argue, well, it's not perfect, so therefore we shouldn't do it at all. And so it's kind of, I think one of the key things that should be in that discussion is like, you know, is it useful to provide something we know isn't perfect? And if the answer could be yes, like it's like, okay, for people who want to turn this on, there's limitations, but it's sort of like, well, I put my seatbelt on in addition to having an airbag. Or do we have, you know, do we have to have something which is like, you know, if we provide it, it's got to be bulletproof. The other thing I think is we probably want to, you know, maybe start with our security model, because the security model, I think today is we're not providing a sandbox, right? And so it's a fundamental change if we're going to say, well, the goal is to provide an actual sandbox, I think. And, you know, so if we say, well, our model is, you know, we don't provide a sandbox, you know, we assume you're running trusted code, then how do these sort of things like security policies fit into that, right? It doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't mean that they're not still potentially useful. It just means that what context that we might look at them through, right? I don't know if anybody else wants to add in their remembrance of context, that kind of stuff.
I remember a few years ago, we had discussions about that, and we could not really agree on the threat and attacker model that's at stake. And that, in my opinion, usually should be the first step of designing a security system, is what are we trying to prevent as an attack? What is the attacker doing that we want to make impossible? and what are the trade-off acceptable? Because sandboxes are great. Usually they come with performance costs, which can be totally acceptable if they are well documented and benchmarked by the end user. But really the question is, are we fighting something that's really useful to fight? I was reading a blog post about Dino in production this morning, and they highlighted that they end up having all authorization in PaaS, because when building a web server, you need file system access, you need network access, which is totally fair, because I don't think that's what the security model of this permission system is fighting. It's mostly fighting supply chain attack and rogue code doing arbitrary stuff on the server. So that maybe that's the security as the ex-security consultant talking, but I really prefer to see what are we trying to fight and how, rather than, hey, we can have those security features working, which is great, and the nerd in me loves them too.
Anybody else, thoughts, comments they want to add before we dive into discussion?
I just want to bring up policies that you can create already, but there's very little tooling around that, and that's maybe something that we can improve on, like creating policies, auditing them, and yeah, that's just something I feel like tooling could really have a massive impact.
Okay, it's a good note. Remember to look back into that as well. Any other thoughts, comments? So maybe we can, I kind of agree with Vladimir that like starting with this, like I think writing some thoughts on the security model and then possibly like getting into that, like that may lead to the threats and attackers and stuff as a good place to start the discussion. And I don't think we can get through like defining our security model or any of this, but I think if we can come have a bit of a discussion and then try and use that to drive like what are concrete next steps and things we think are important to try and make progress on would be a good use of the time. Does that make sense to people?
If I might just add one thing that's a little bit tricky. Sorry, I've got an echo. I'm busy finishing this apartment, but one thing that's a little bit tricky about trying to define the security model is that there's so many different approaches to it. So it's not like there's one model. And then you also brought up that great point earlier, Michael, that there is the sense that like, because security is an all or nothing thing, when it comes to next steps, it's difficult to say we can definitely go in this direction when there is a lot of uncertainty. So a lot of dealing with the security as a project is how do you research potentially completely different security directions and allow the project to explore those directions and actually come up with solutions, even if they might not end up being comprehensive, but at the same time, that shouldn't hinder the ability for the project to really explore some of these spaces where there's a lot of interesting possibilities. So it's a tough one to really tackle, and so it's good to put some thought to that, and maybe thinking about security models quite broadly as opposed to trying to have one specific model or one perfect security model that has to be specifically chased up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's like, so one of the outcomes of this could be some thoughts around like, what is our strategy, right? And like, how does that strategy support us exploring important areas, you know?
Or even just like, there are a bunch of different use cases and they might have completely different technical solutions, and then just kind of break it down. And that's maybe where the WebAssembly focus is really great, actually, because instead of having to sort of broadly think about Node.js security, you could just say, if you have Wasm using WASI and you want to restrict the capability of that bit of WebAssembly dependency, you know, that's a sort of a technical question on its own. How do you create some guarantees around that WebAssembly when it's using
WASI, which potentially has access to everything. So it's a fine-grained policy at the most WASI level, so yeah, maybe splitting out some use cases around various user scenarios or things like that could make sense as well.
Yeah, I think like it doesn't need to be one comprehensive. Like our strategy could be like to accept like acknowledgement that there's like these 5 different use cases, and maybe we prioritize like this one is the most important one, but that doesn't mean we don't think about the one at the bottom, right? Or I think there's value in us sort of coming to some sort of consensus on what the set of things are, maybe relative priorities, but hopefully not. Yeah, it doesn't have to be like, hey, this is our one approach, I think is what you're trying to make sure.
Yeah, or for listing different scenarios and then prioritizing them. That sounds like a good approach. Yeah,
and it could just be like, yeah, it's like, and it comes down to like, are there people willing to actively investigate them or not? But it's still a value for us having looked at them and saying, well, if somebody does have time, this looks interesting, or, well, no, we just don't think this fits for some reason, right? Okay. Any other thoughts, comments before we maybe start talking a little bit about what a security model might look like, or what it, uses of it, and I think, or multiple models or whatever. Try and promote Stephen again. Oh, okay. So he says just like, right. So I think on the security model, one of the key things maybe to think about or to start out the discussion, correct me if other people have better ideas, is like, what would we use it for? And the one that I'll throw out is, basically as a filter for vulnerability reports. We get a number of reports. Some of those are, we end up closing because they don't fit what we have in our mind as a security model. And having that well documented and published, I think, would help, like either in terms of us being able to point to the security model to say, hey, this doesn't fall under that, or, helping to avoid them being submitted in the first place. Are there other use cases people can think of, like ways we'd use that security model? Sort of the typical, like, penetration testing is one that comes to mind. I mean, we don't do it today, but that would be another. If you wanted to say, well, let's go look for vulnerabilities, the security model might help in terms of where you would look.
Here's the thing, Node.js is very unopinionated, and there's a lot of things that we don't do fully. So I'm thinking about the CV that was published last week and that has been redacted by Mitch, that said that because there was an it in the way URL are parsed when there was an arrobas, an at inside, someone claimed that could lead to user spoofing or authentication bypass, which doesn't make sense because we don't provide any authentication primitives. It would make sense in a full stack project that would rely on that to identify the user, maybe. And so there are the things that are extremely clear, can be part of our security model. Like there's a problem in crypto that has a bypass in some cryptographic method. We're using weak cryptographic algorithms. Those are ones that are industry standards. And I think it's pretty fair for us to be able to consider them as first-class targets for pen test. For anything that is higher in in the abstraction layers, in the application layers, it's more debatable. Even on the NPM modules level, it was hard to identify what really was a vulnerability or not. So I guess we can sort the thing between syscall, that's a totally arbitrary attempt, between syscalls that are supposed to behave a specific way or proven exploits that have been admitted in the industry, like HTTP smuggling. And if we can find reproduction of these attacks with new vectors, we should consider them as vulnerability with no-brainers. But maybe we need to declare what would be our test if we have a set of exploits we already trust and say that similar exploits could be used. That's really like thinking as much as I speak, so feel free to interject and disagree.
Right, so you're kind of thinking like there's some things that like if we documented these types of attacks, we have felt our vulnerabilities and therefore are in scope. And these kinds of things we think are out of scope that would be useful.
Maybe explaining why we accepted certain reports on HackerOne and why some others has not been accepted and has been showed as a simpler bug would be a good way to highlight what we accept and what we don't accept in terms of pen test.
Right. Yeah, it's a good thought. Any other thoughts? I guess in terms of the security model, like, you know, the filter for vulnerability reports, penetration testing, any other thoughts in terms of like what we might as a project use it for?
So, I mean, I would add a few things to kind of like lists of things to explore, but I don't know how appropriate they are for this kind of context. But so it could be worth exploring, you know, stronger sandboxing primitives. Do things like shadow realms. Are there entire use cases around them in Node.js where you can still have third-party dependencies, or you know, can you use them in a real app to solve a real sandboxing problem? Thinking about, as I said at the beginning, a WASI virtualization. If you wanted to load like some arbitrary WASM, and you wanted to have guarantees that it's only going to have access to one folder on the file system, can one have a strong way, because at the moment it's all in JS and it's just convention, is there a strong way to or even just think about it from a security perspective? And then currently policies do control dependency locking, and that's a sort of a security guarantee. Is it possible to strengthen the security guarantee that the current Node.js policies already provide? And what could be done to strengthen those guarantees? And that's also coming in from a direction of like, it's not solving everything, but it can start to provide more clear boundaries, and it can start to make things that would be very easy harder. It's much harder to ship a dependency that suddenly is going to be importing FS when you've got a policy that locks down that package doesn't have access to FS. And that is a workflow that can be used today. There's even like interesting ideas like, would you want to have each dependency gets a different version of FS, where one gets an FS with privileges to one folder and another gets an FS with only read privileges to another folder, or things like that. So you can have sort of dependency customization, but that's also getting back into this kind of very fine-grained, and those fine-grained models are entirely dependent on a lot of lockdown primitives like frozen intrinsics and process.dlopen being deprecated as well, which is one of the biggest hindrances to that kind of workflow at the moment. And I know that's always a tricky discussion, those kind of models, but especially in light of the fact that often it does end up in Dino that it's easy just to add a -A or whatever it is flag. That maybe these models do get put under a light for exploration again. Yeah, and deprecating process.dlopen is definitely an important consideration in amongst those.
Or that's process.dlopen.
Yeah, because there's no way to control that all code will always be able to execute any arbitrary binary on the whole system. So, and there's no way to control that. So no matter what other security guarantees you have, any module or any piece of executing code can always just use process.dlopen to do anything. And so that's a simple one to lock down potentially. But again, it's as I say, it's a super tough direction to go in because it's very easy to argue against. But if there are small things that could make it harder to do bad things, then surely that's a good thing. So.
Like in that context, I always wonder, what is the minimum that would need to be in Node itself versus, you know, that Node taking on the attempt to provide these, right? Like, so for example, if there's a flag that says, you know, disable run securely or whatever you wanted to call it, and it you know, has a limited to no overhead and disables a few things, that seems like a much easier conversation to me than like, okay, we're gonna not have anybody use dlopen again, right? Or be able to use it.
Definitely. So maybe package some of these things up and have a kind of call it an experimental security, you know, and the fact is it's not solving it. It's not giving you a comprehensive security model, but it's making it a little bit more difficult for people to do bad stuff. And maybe there is a way that those things can be explored further if there is progress there and people are interested in working on that and exploring them.
Yeah, it could kind of come back to like, our strategy is that we want to, we're not looking to wholesale implement these things as a project yet, but we want to encourage experimentation. And so, you know, the kind of things that we should be looking to do are to, you know, do these smaller, low overhead things that, you know, on their own, maybe people would argue like, well, why are you doing that? But it's like, well, if it supports the experimentation in these areas, you know, adding them as experimental makes sense because we want to support that. Like that could be our, I'm not saying that should be our strategy, but like that would be one way to go at the strategy, is to not say, let's go, you know, the project needs to have a big push to say implement any one of these, but we do want to work in a way that enables people to do that, right? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and maybe people don't know about flags like version intrinsics, and having some kind of sort of documented security effort or efforts that kind of start to bring these whole workflows together, where that's just a piece that's used. And then with policies and things like that, it can start to explore working up to bigger picture security stuff in an experimental way. But yeah, as long as it's clear that it's experimental and it's, as you say, just working towards these things. And there's a huge amount of, I mean, they're really interesting things to work on. I've always wanted to mess around with this stuff more. But it also, yeah, it depends on people being interested in doing that. And that as one effort, and then sandboxing, and then other types of models also, I think. So there's not a single kind of direction.
I mean, I'm just looking under strategy, like we can write a few things that, you know, from at least from this discussion, we could propose as a strategy, you know, like our strategy is like, we want to support experimentation, things like experimental overhead additions are good. I don't know if other people have thoughts of other things we'd add into the list based on what you think. mean, and we may even try and, like, I'm just thinking out loud, like we can start out with, I think it's, my take and understanding is that, like, today we're not, the goal of the project is not to provide a sandbox. If we documented a model, I think it would be pretty clear that, like, even things like I think the VM module, like, it's not intended to be a sandbox. We're not going to take vulnerability reports. So, like, our current security model is X. We bound it like this, and that would be like, we're not a security model, we're not a sandbox, blah, blah, blah. But the second part of our strategy could be, but, we understand that, sandboxes are interested to people, policies, we're maybe not at the point in the project to say that we've come to that. We don't have the full, like, here are the attacks, here's the protection, can we actually make them work? But we do respect that they're an interesting area of exploration, and here's what we want to do to support that exploration, right? Because that's where, so that's where we can discuss, like, where do we want to sort of draw that in what we say we think our strategy should be, how should we cast each of these different things? And I think that would be useful just as a starting point, because the challenge I see is a lot of these are very complicated. And so getting agreement like, hey, we should do this, there's going to be a hugely long discussion on any one of them. But it may be easier to say, it's important as a project to our future success that we don't just block things, like block experimentation. And when somebody does figure out how to do it properly, well, they've done it somewhere else, right? We'd rather they come back and say, look, I've done all this great work. And when you look at it, you say, it's like, wow, that's amazing. That solved all the problems we couldn't think through earlier, right? And I think back to the other point of, like, a couple people, I think Guy and it might have been Vladimir, but if it was somebody else, I apologize. It was kind of like pointing out that there's different use cases. So even, like, some documentation around, like, if you're running in containers, this may or may, we don't see this as an issue, but if you're running in these other situations, maybe it is an issue, and therefore it's more interesting. Some work around that would kind of be interesting too. I see some questions. So, like, there was, can we make native modules need to be declared as CLI flags when starting? I'm not sure I quite understand that. Is that
related to the discussion about the process.dlopen, where we highlighted that native modular bypass for any security model right now.
right? Because I think there was already some work around, like, isn't there a command line flag to enable or disable loading native modules? For some reason, I thought.
I remember we discussed it, but I don't know. No add-on. There is the no add-on to prevent modules, but maybe we don't have an in-between flag that allows to load only certain modules with a hash, but maybe policies cover that.
Right. Okay. So there's. So I'm just trying to go back to, like, where do we start on a model? I think today the current model is does not provide a sandbox, right?
No, we assume that the end user trusts the code they are running. Right. I don't know if we are saying that publicly, but that's at least what we deliver as a runtime. whether this is JavaScript or native modules.
Right. So that, yeah. So I think that, yeah, that's, I don't know, that there's part of like, we should document, one of the priorities is to document a security model that says that as our, where are we today? And that fits into the, like, in terms of vulnerability reports and stuff, what would we would use it for. Are there any other key things? Like, I don't know if we can write up our whole security model today, but like, there are any other key elements that people understand in terms of being part of our security model? So we trust that code. We trust the code that's run. So if you ask us to run arbitrary code and it does something, well, that's just understood.
That can change in the future, but as of today, yeah.
Right. Any other, I think, I mean, you were pointing out a few things like we in things like dependencies and stuff, we don't think they're vulnerabilities if they don't impact, I don't know how to write that, like, but like they don't affect things that we don't provide ourselves, kind of thing, right? Is that, like, it's, I guess it's clear, like if it's a problem, if the crypto algorithm is, incorrect or something like that, like but it still comes back to like, what's a bug versus what's a vulnerability? Do we have any other sort of things we should write down on that front?
That it really depends how it is used. I'm the AppSec person focused, and I always want to make the bridge between observability and security, where we have diagnostic channel that can be used to observe what the code is doing. Because running a weak crypto algorithm, let's say you're running MD5, you should not use MD5 for anything critical, but maybe you just want to have a fast way of checking if two things are similar and the likelihood of MD5 having collisions is so low or useless is your use case. So that's really opinionated. Like if we had a method, safely hash that, and that would be MD5, that would be a problem. So I guess my point here is, how do we make sure that people know what runs in their application? Which methods are called? How many file access calls are made? How many crypto calls are made? How many network calls are made outside of the app by the code? Because you end up in this situation of whether the code written in the organization or through third-party modules is so big that you don't know what syscalls happen for which reasons. And providing good observability in enterprise context probably answers some of these questions already, because you give code auditability.
Right.
And then you can say, we never want MD5 to run in the app, and you get an alert each time MD5 runs, so you know why, which is the shortcut of monkey patching the MD5 method with an error being thrown and having a stack trace.
Right. So I think I took a note that's like, observability can mitigate risks, right?
Yep.
So it can kind of drive why you would want some observability side of things. In terms of the model and current, like we assume the current model, like if what we were just capturing quickly, like what are our top level beliefs about the models? It's not a sandbox. We assume user trust codes that is running. Is it like problems need to have an impact? I'm trying to understand that, like, again, the vulnerability versus bug.
That's a good question. Probably $1 million question when we do the HackerOne triage. Really, that's why it's a bit cowardly from me to say that we should eventually maybe find a CWE that fits it, and if we agree that the impact on a publicly documented CWE like SQL injection, authentication bypass is undisputable, at least we've got that sorted. But that's really the security consultants and the process-oriented solution, and maybe that doesn't fit what we want to build here.
I don't know, like that makes some sense to me. Like basically you want a CWE in an exploit to be considered a vulnerability, right?
At least that's straightforward because it's kind of industry standards. So, but then there will be always these things in the gray area where people will dispute whether it applies to a given CWE. Or also, it's not always a good thing to ask for a definitive exploit. For instance, when we had the first report of prototype pollution, we saw a bug. We were not exactly 100% clear on the real implication. I at this point thought, okay, it can at least crash applications by changing globals. So I will consider that as a vulnerability with denial of service impacts. Then 2 years later, someone used that to get a remote code injection in Kibana, exploitation in Kibana, and I did not see that coming, and I did not have that in my threat model back then. So I'm happy I accepted the prototype pollution problem back then, but I could not imagine that it would lead to such shenanigans. Yeah, I'm countering my own arguments. I see.
I guess it's the nothing's going to be perfect, right? So it's finding something which is helpful. Obviously, that if you get in a case where it's like this doesn't make sense, then you can argue against it. But
we always discuss incoming reports when we have doubts. So maybe having guidelines for the clear stuff helps, and keeping the door open to discuss the unclear ones.
Yeah. So it's the CWE. I mean, and I wonder if there's even like some categories where we could say typically these ones don't apply. Right? Like your authentication example, is it that like we just don't expect? You know, although I think like authentication, I could see in HTTP, you know, related to certificate validation and stuff, that kind of seems like authentication to me.
It kind of depends what features we provide out of Node. We provide proper HTTP parsing, and when there are bugs, we accept them as bugs because we provide HTTP parsing. We provide proper file access, but we don't provide any authentication primitives, as far as I know, in the documentation.
We do check certificates. So when you connect to a website, we will authenticate the certificate and tell you no, it wasn't. So that's a form, I think, of that.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I guess, I mean, and I don't want to, we can't spend all of our time, but maybe a little bit more time is still good. But like, the other thing I wonder is like, there's a distinction between like, okay, there's some behavior in Node, which you may not like, or maybe isn't perfect, but it doesn't actually cause Node to do anything wrong. But you can actually make it do something wrong in a module on top of it. Does that, you know, is that something in our model or not, right? Like we might be able to say that, you know, it must be, you know, for us to take it as a vulnerability, it must make Node do something obviously wrong.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of, we won't say that Node allow arbitrary file system reading. that's definitely higher level code that can be miswritten and allow anyone to browse the local file system of a web server.
Right.
So in a way, it comes down to the feature we provide, and we want this feature to work well. I think I'm rephrasing what you just said in a way, so sorry for that. But yeah, we maybe being extra clear on what features we provide and what, yeah. Because at this point, we provide the same feature of, say, Python or Ruby as a runtime.
Right. So maybe our model is like we expect vulnerabilities to be manifested with just node APIs, right? Like if you got to have a bunch of other stuff on top of it to cause a problem, then, if it's like, yeah, node does something slightly off, but then 3 other things have to do the wrong thing. That's maybe one of we're not necessarily trying to fix that.
Can always help to fix and mitigate when we introduce an argument to disable proto. That was a move to enable mitigations of things we provide, same thing for policies. So we are not opinionated, but we don't have not to be. We can live in a world where we are not opinionated by default, but we give people the tools to be more opinionated. Do they wish to be? Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah, I think can be confused. I think a lot of that depends on the reporter's level, right? I mean, if you are not dealing with a very experienced one, I think when the people have a lot of experience reporting, they do a lot of these pre-checks, their own. But when you are dealing with people who doesn't have a lot of experience, then it's like, oh, I see a prototype pollution, not very sure about how this might impact anything, and then it's like they try to delegate, like raising the hand. I see this, but no idea if this become a real problem or not at all, So yeah, I think it's hard. Maybe we can provide some, basic context for those kind of reporters in a way, like saying like, these are the top 10 most typical we like reports, and this is the common non-things that we, reports that we doesn't work due to these reasons. So people have a better context of why authentication is not in scope, why this kind of process by third level is not in scope, and all of that. So they can have a better, clear idea, because I think it's the idea, from coders try to finding bugs rather than security researchers. So there is this jump line, this blur line in the middle, right? I think that might be a good option with not a lot of effort from us, just to provide some examples, maybe that can help a little bit.
Yeah, I think I tried to capture it as, maybe tell me if this fits, like our strategy is to look to help code on top, avoiding making mistakes, but doing so is not considered a vulnerability in node.js. Right, like just because node lets you do something that can cause a security vulnerability, that we as a project, we very much want to help avoid that, but it's not considered a vulnerability, and so we may or may not change APIs and code to help that, but we won't treat it as a vulnerability with CVs and releases and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's like more to identify like bad practices, right, from the people. So something that you're supposed not to do, or that's not the way that it's supposed to be, like I think it's catching the point of Lightning as well of, like trying to be opinionated, although we are not, on those kind of things, like, please don't use MD5 for this context, these kind of things, like really, really putting people on context. And also I think makes sense also to, collect those kind of things and put it in one place so people can know like good things to do and bad things to do as well. Might give a lot of context for many people.
I'm just typing a little bit in the doc on like potentially things we could have in our strategy, like not currently planning to provide sandbox functionality, but want to support experimentation.
I agree. We need to be clear on being open-minded about new strategies and new mechanisms. There are so many upcoming attacker models that keep an eye on what's happening outside and how they solve certain problems is a must do for us.
Right. So it would be good to like, I think for us, like documenting the attack, what did you call that? Like attack models or?
Threat model, attack model, they usually work, yeah.
Documenting threat models and current state of the art, right? Because that would be another part of like a high level strategy is that we think it's good to document these threat models and the current state of the art. You know, it's like, okay, say you're in, I don't know, you're deploying in containers. The current state of the art is, well, you use the container approaches to, you know, if you want to shut off being able to go to the network, you use that, right? And then in a desktop threat model, that might be a different case, right? And the current model is, well, you know, you're going to have to figure out something else to be able to do that.
I think that's a very important point. And I really like what you just said, that we need to also think the desktop model as a first-class citizen as well as the Docker model. Yeah. Because that's a gut feeling, but I think most of Node.js daily users use Node.js to build front-end stuff on their desktop, more than, at least in terms of humans, maybe not in terms of machines.
Yep. Yeah, CLIs and all of that as well. Yeah, there's a lot of wild applications out there. Yeah. Do we want to include in this documentation as well the state of the art regarding attacks for, you know, third-party modules, like, I don't know, type of scripting attacks, you know, this kind of very, very, you know, close to our ecosystem, these kind of things, or we want to focus only on Node.js core as much as possible?
I think what makes sense in my mind is to document just enough so that we can say, this is what we think Node core should be doing or not doing to solve the problem. Like, here's the threat model, here's the context. You know, in this model, the assumption is your protection is going to come from this other component. We're not doing anything in Node. Then the next one could be, well, in this model, this is our assumptions in terms of, you know, where we think, and then we can say like, and it's therefore we think it's critical that Node provide X in that context would be a useful resource to have, because it would let you clearly say like, okay, you know, even if we're not there, we could say, we think for our future success, it's important that we work towards this or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So what, any other sort of strategic things? Like I wrote some bullet points here for strategy. It's like, we should document a security model and accept and handle security vulnerabilities in line with that model. And it just took a few notes in terms of, where did I take those notes in terms of the model? You know, I think the two things we had is, it's not a sandbox. We assume the user trusts the code it's running. That's both JS and native code, and it must be able to manifest with just the node APIs. But maybe I think I had a better description of that because I'm probably writing this multiple places. Where is the other one? Because I think I like the other text.
Yeah, just Michael, could you maybe promote Stefan?
Yeah, I've tried to promote him a few times. Let me do it again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so now he's back. So yeah, so that's great. Okay. Where is the sorry, I'm just looking at the where did we write that other useful text? Sorry. Oh, right. Okay. Look to help code. Right. So that was in the strategy, right? I can, okay. So that's fine. So I'm just going to put that in there. Okay, so I guess we just had that too. It's that are related. It's not a sandbox, and then it must be able to manifest with just the node APIs. And then the next
also,
part, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. Also linked to the strategy, because I think some people don't really need that part, or at least they maybe use other tool, or they have some other kind of way to mitigate security issue in their code or solution. So are we sure that everyone want to have this kind of trade-off? Because security is always a trade-off, or at least most of the case of the time, it will be a trade-off with performances, or at least you will have a small impact of on performances. So do we want to integrate that into the basic runtime, or do we want to publish the current runtime and one which will implement more security related stuff? So what will be our target there?
Right. I guess maybe that's part of the strategy is like, is it opt-in for one? And does opt-in mean like command line flags or a separate distribution or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a product question on the end user experience. And we have multiple situations, as Jean said. We have the Visual Studio solution where we've got different vision of the same product, or we can have a single binary but a global configuration that says, hey, that's a desktop configuration, so give me the default desktop configuration. Or that's a web server, I don't need any of that, I've got Docker. And that's an interesting one, but that's probably one of the biggest change in the history of the Node project, at least in today's discussions.
Right. So I guess, I just wrote, which may or may not be not right. Like part of the strategy is like today, any additional functionality has to be opt-in and the default behavior must be low overhead. We're not looking to add in policies, for example, if they reduce performance for everybody by 10%. It's kind of what I think. We're kind of at lately, we want to enable experimentation, but until it gets to the point where like we can, it would be an extra step, I think, to make the case that says, hey, it's worth taking significant performance to turn one of these on by default, right? In terms of our current strategy, not to say that couldn't change at some point. Or
I know exactly how that PR would go.
Right. So I think it, like documenting that in the strategy is good so that people have that expectation that's like, today, this is what you should expect, right? Like our project strategy is, yeah, we want to support experimentation, but this is the sort of one of the limits. So that's another one. So we've got like, we should document a security model and use that to drive and handle our vulnerable reports. We do want to help code avoid making mistakes, but we don't consider that a vulnerability in Node. Not currently planning to provide sandbox functionality, but want to support experimentation. When I say sandbox functionality, is all these things that people talk about experimenting with fall into that category, or are there several other categories too? Okay, we can kind of leave that in there, unless other, and then, you know, documenting threat models and current state of the art for each of the different environments is part of our strategy. We'd like to do that because then it'll help explain like the story that says, well, why aren't we worried about this? Well, because in this Docker environment, these things, you know, we don't think there's a risk, and because we expect you're going to get it from these other things. We got today, any additional functionality would be opt-in and the default behavior must be low overhead. Maybe that's a little bit more tightly to go with the experimentation side of things. Any other strategy sort of level things we think are worth adding in, at least in an initial draft that we would document? And
maybe that's a bit. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so I think it will be nice also to, you know, as we are planting, I think in the long term, it's going to be a lot of changes, you know, that might affect quite a lot to Node. Maybe it's okay if we can start to do, you know, little changes and ask for validations. So that way, later on, we can have more people involved, you know, instead of having like a super huge big change in terms of policies or in terms of how Node is going to behave for the users, you know, and we need flags to be running and all of that. We can just go with little ideas, validate against some maybe core members and see if everybody's happy and in the same path, and we can get feedback super fast so we can iterate over the ideas. So that way we can build something big at the end, but made by little chunks that we know that are kind of okay by everybody. So the final picture will be more or less easier to agree, you know, with the rest of the people if we are happy with the pieces that make the whole puzzle a good thing. That maybe be a good strategy in terms of, you know, speed up the process, iterate a lot, and, you know, try to collect a lot of feedback, but not very sure, you know, seems like for me, seems like a big change, but maybe right now there are more things in the scope. I mean, for other working groups that are having a different strategy that works better, but maybe having something like that can be a good option for now.
Is this kind of captured? Maybe I'm putting something else into it, but like try to limit change in core to just what is needed to enable experimentation.
I think it's okay, yeah.
It's kind of like, you know, if we add something small that supports something, you know, out of core, that may be more successful than saying like, here are these 3,000 lines of code I'd like to add in. So for example, like in permissions, if there's like 3 API points, we could put in a check or something, but leave the rest of the permissions outside. That as a strategy might be more successful in getting things, allowing things to progress, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's okay. And as experimental, when we consolidate it, you know, then we can have a final idea with, you know, just having all under one single flag or whatever. So, you know, it gives us a lot of freedom of iteration, you know, because everybody expects to be experimental and not solid. So that gives us a lot of freedom.
Right. Okay, any other things that would make a good strategy in terms of helping to support these kinds of things or making progress?
Maybe that's a bit off topic, but is there any opportunity with the Node.js certification curriculum in terms of reviewing the security impacts and making sure that people who get the certification have all the understanding of the node security model as it is, and can answer for these questions, at least are clear on what we do and what we don't do?
I think, yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, how much content do you think would be there?
I guess there is the question of, is VM a security sandbox? And making sure that everyone we certify knows it's not a security sandbox. That would probably save a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't really know the curriculum for the certification. I just checked a training course and making sure that basics of crypto may be understood and understanding what's the impact of using the file system. That I don't really know enough. I'm just know that education is 90% of security most of the time. And
Right.
we've got an education vector as a team.
Okay. So security.
Yeah, because right now you have nothing about security on the certification part, if I remember right. Maybe just on the service developer, which is the one around web services and API and website. And if I remember for talking about it with someone, it's mostly about basic security, like handling errors and hiding which kind of server is returning the information, or so not really security, let's say mostly best practices. So yeah, it's that protecting against malicious input and attack mitigation. Yeah, so quite basic and not really around security for Node.js, but most security for just an API.
Right. I think, and there's, I mean, it's a big topic, security for a Node or JavaScript application overall. But I think of what I heard Vladimir suggesting is maybe we should try and have in the training or somewhere like some content which would just cover what is the Node security model itself. Like, what is Node looking to provide you? That seems like that's a good part of a strategy to say this would be this would add value overall.
Yeah, because we are currently, we do have a lot of resources about using Node.js or doing stuff. The certification is also around that, both of them, and we don't have, but pretty much like every other languages, runtime or everything, we don't really have a lot of stuff around doing how someone can be sure about the security of their application, what should they check on a, let's say, daily basis. And for a lot of people and for a lot of companies, we don't really have a security team, or let's say a security team which is able to deep dive into the code and be able to understand what issue can be present. So maybe it can be, like you said, it can be something interesting to provide a way to enlighten people to be aware of security issue on their application.
That's something that on my side we're not discussing about Corey, but we are working on this on one of the projects I work on, and one of the things we do is reporting a lot of information on what Node.js module is used and what functionality is in use. And so I guess we go in this way of trying to help and educate, like Vladimir said. It's one of the biggest and hardest things because, you know, security is hard, and even on feature like VM, and people do not read all the text, and sometimes, yeah, you need that's why we need also to work around maybe tools and things like this to help and educate people on.
I think that whole
this.
part is like, that's a whole huge topic on its own. That's, I would say it's a different topic, right? Like that. And there is a collaboration space that's going to spin up under the OpenJS Foundation. And I think that would be a good place to discuss like what kind of resources can be put in place to help projects and, you know, standard, what's a security reporting process that a project should have. And then you even like then onto the end users. I don't think that's something the node project itself is necessarily going to drive or has driven in the past anyway. So I guess I'm just like, yeah, I think that's important, but I would suggest joining that other effort to kind of cover those kinds of things. They may then drive input into what we, you know, this a living strategy in terms of like, well, what's important to have in Node to support some of those things. But I kind of think they're just history wise, we're not going to drive them within the project ourselves necessarily. But back to the you know, the suggestion that a small section that kind of says, have you reviewed what the Node.js model provides you, yes or no? And then like the question could be, does Node provide a sandbox? If you say yes, you didn't read the context, right?
We could have discount for people who answer properly that for conference tickets or certifications.
Right. But I think that's one way to get the message out, which is interesting. Yeah. And yeah, so that can be part of our, what we think is a useful strategy, and as a draft that makes sense to say, hey, can we add something that just covers what we've documented once we get there? Any other things like that like part of the, you know, we should say the core project itself in terms of the strategy, you know, what do we think is important that we're working on, and sort of in what context are we working on it, right? Like, you know, is there anything that like people would advocate, oh, we have to have X, or, you know, 10 years from now Node's going to be irrelevant, right? And we need to do that this year, or, you know, like, or is what we've got in terms of like, hey, we just want to support experimentation. So if something does become important, we've not stopped it from being explored. Is there anything that's more in the category of, nope, if we don't do it now, our future is at stake, kind of?
Hard to say. I would say that not doubling down on a diagnostic channel is not helpful, because in my opinion it helps with enterprise and enterprise grade tooling adoption. But disclaimer, I work in a company that does Node.js instrumentation, so that's probably biased of me.
I think I agree. It may not come in the security. I wouldn't have put it in the security strategy. We have diagnostics and observability as one of our top technical strategies. So I would have put it under that in terms of like, what should our strategy be? What should we do? I do take your point though, that like diagnostics can be a source of it, you know, can also help you mitigate risks and stuff.
It's the same with post-mortem diagnostics that can help for forensic issues. So pretty much most of what we have on the diagnostic side might be leveraged for security considerations. I did not think that sentence true, so feel free to find counterexamples, but usually they can help for post-mortem or preventing exploitation as they happen. But I agree with you, there are probably secondary security topics and primary diagnostics topics.
Yeah, so live monitoring, security post-mortem, but will be covered under diagnostics. So I think that's like worth saying as part of our strategy is like, we recognize that observability and providing diagnostic info is important to support live monitoring security postmortem, but it should be covered under the diagnostic strategy versus the security strategy on its own. Because
maybe what it means is that we can sometimes give the strategy perspective on the diagnostics topic. Like having diagnostic channels being two ways or other topics. That's the only example I have in mind.
Right. Yeah, it's like if there wasn't going to be a deep dive on diagnostics, then maybe we would want to cover it under security. So it's good. I think it's good to list it explicitly in the strategy that says, yep, this is something, but should be adequately covered if we had a good diagnostic story for all of the different reasons, right? I guess the only thing that feeds into that is like, and is there any specific info we provide just because it's security wise versus what you would get if you're just looking for regular observability, in which case, you know, it might be worth calling that out as worthwhile to provide through those channels.
I don't know. I don't think so. Stefan, are you aware of anything?
As far as I know, like Node Core is still only providing like HTTP requests start and end. We can add other stuff if we want anything, but specifically.
My question was more just in general, like if we work on our diagnostic strategy, would that naturally end up with what we want for this security component? Or are there things like, you know, certain information that you would only provide because you're saying we want to provide information through those channels for security as well?
Well, it's just a generic data channel. So like what you choose to do with it, it's up to you. We can use that for like observability stuff, but like observability in a lot of ways like overlaps. Like we're gonna see like if we look at the HTTP start and end, we're gonna see like what routes are people requesting, and like there's stuff in that data that we could potentially look at to identify like malicious traffic and things like that if we wanted to. But it's not really the responsibility of diagnostics channel itself. I would say it's kind of left up to whoever is using it, how they choose to use it. It's a tool and you can use it many ways.
Right. Okay. So now I think the answer is we don't have anything specific to call out. Let me see, is there what else? I'm just looking at some of the suggestions from Guy and stronger sandboxes, shadow RAM, was it virtualization policies? I think these all kind of fall into, you know, we think it's important to support experimentation in these areas, but it back to that, like with the strategy of, you know, whatever the minimum is required in Node to be able to support that exploration. And, you know, the expectation is that it's got to be opt-in, and the overhead when you haven't opted in is going to be small. So I'm sorry, I'm just looking still here. What else would it make sense for us to discuss now? In terms of the threat models, we had Docker, we had desktop. Are there any others that we can think of while we've got the group together here?
Not sure if CLI will fall under desktop, or we treat it as a different. Okay.
Can put that in.
Web workers would be a server kind of thing, like a Lambda taking something from a queue and doing async work of that, I think. Or are there differences between the web server model?
I think I just changed like Docker to the server model, right? Because I guess it's like we expect that most often in the server, you're going to deploy in a container that will give you the protection, separation, that kind of stuff, right? And or I guess OS. Yeah, anyway, maybe it's like server, desktop, CLI, desktop app, CLI, any other ones where it would be?
Do we want to add something on that part? Let's say Node.js application. I'm thinking about .exe or PKG compile application.
Yeah, okay, single executable. It's like that, basically.
Maybe it's not in the list, but just a suggestion, maybe building packages, like third-party modules that later on you push to NPM. So maybe that have specific threads or not. So I'm not very sure it should be in the list or not. So just raising the question.
Is there a CI case? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Is there a CI case like GitHub Action, Circle CI?
Right, okay, like CI.
I think it's kind of a continuation of what you just said, Ulysses.
Yeah, I think I'm going that line, yeah.
So like when node is used in the CI/CD pipeline, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one because that's like, can it inject? Could it be, is there certain ways where it could be used to inject, vulnerabilities or whatever? And is there something that you could do to address that?
Yeah, usually you have shared. Yeah, you could pollute something on the infrastructure and the next user would be at risk, like shared worker
right.
or anything.
So in terms of, action, so maybe let's say, we've got the strategy, right? So if we looked at those strategy components, the things we would want to do, I think one is like an action would be like to define and document the security model, right? Maybe I'm going to say capture document strategy, then document security model. Then anything specific that should be in terms of the experimentation side, are there things that like we would call out as actions that, you know, people want to do, want or volunteering to do, you know, that we would prioritize? If we basically had a resource to say, go off and focus on this, what would it be that they would ask? We would ask like this, the documenting the strategy, I'll volunteer to do that based on what we discussed today. The security model, I am hoping that maybe when we get some external security resources, that would be a really good starting point for them. Is there another thing that like if we had those resources, we'd say, hey, here's something that we can all agree would be our next thing to do?
I think the part when we discussed benchmarking what works and what will be needed for the cases is important, but because that's what's gonna tell node contributor which directions we are interested in. And the sooner people start hacking around, the more interesting it gets.
Right. So documenting the threat models and current state of the art would be the next thing on the list.
Yeah, if everyone agrees.
I see at least one head nodding. That makes a lot of sense to me because that would give us the context. Like if we can get agreement on that, then it may be easier to then say, well, should we prioritize one of these versus another? And like, is it actually holding us back or not? Or, you know, is noted as at a competitive disadvantage for desktop applications, or is it just the same as any desktop application, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Any other actions? And maybe I'll make it action/priorities because we may not have volunteers immediately to do them, but like if we're prioritizing what we would want to have happen to make progress on this. I think that's a decent start. I guess my question would be like, is there anything in this area that we haven't discussed that we should, or, you know, we got some gap that we didn't, in all the discussion, we didn't sort of cover, or that we should dive into a little bit to see if there's any other ideas that come out of that?
Yeah, I don't think we spent a lot of time on the idea of isolating modules.
Okay, so let me get, so you want to lead us into that a little bit?
That's the idea of membranes, and that's been around for a while. And can we prevent an NPM module in particular from accessing other system primitives? And I'm always puzzled by this one because it sounds like a killer feature. But at the same time, we know that, as far as I know, the only ways of doing that realistically are performance killers. And in the same time, that will lead to a lot of complexity in configurations. But yeah, saying within a runtime, hey, module X or HTTP endpoint Y can't access a file system altogether is something that's discussed around security models and questions. And as far as I know, there's no much prior art on that, or I'm not aware of any solution that has been widely adopted that provide this feature for the reason I exposed a bit earlier. So that's why I'm always reluctant to talk about it, because as far as I know, it's not really doable.
Right. There's been some, I think, like in core, there was some experimentation with policies and stuff along those lines, but yeah, like I don't think we've come to something where it's like it comes down to it may provide some safety net, but not an infallible one. And is it enough? And otherwise, and to make it infallible, now it's just nobody uses it, right? And
you lose all performances because you have to inspect a whole asynchronous stack trace for each syscalls to know exactly where this syscall has been going through. When it happens. But that's one of the topics that's coming, so I thought we kind of needed.
Yeah, has anybody had any thoughts or ideas on that front? Is there anything going on in the project today on that front that we, or is it like the other runtimes have a solution that actually works and we should be looking at it to say, wait a sec, somebody else has figured this out, and it's valuable to pull it in? Or are we still at the struggling? It would be like Vladimir said, it would be really good to have something like that, but we don't know how to do it practically yet. Are we still at that state? It's worth confirming that's what everybody's understanding is for something else.
I remember there have been some discussions a couple of years ago, but they were very, very early, and I don't know if they followed up. I think not, otherwise I would have heard about them moving forward.
Yeah, I kind of remember pros and intrinsics and stuff like that. I know there's been some work on that front, and I think Bradley is off on with a new child, so he might have had some views to add into that, and maybe we can pull that feedback in a little bit later. But I haven't heard or seen the hey, here it's solved. We've solved it and solved the overhead and all that to the point of being able to pull it in.
A good point. Intrinsic had a commercial solution for that, but I have no idea of how it worked. I think it has a patent on it. So.
I think we can probably drive discussion on some of those through the threat models, because it should be a natural in this particular context, desktop, this is the threat model, and then you can talk about specifically what things help or not. And that seems useful to me in that it's not just like, yeah, okay, policies can help us in abstract, right? It's like, okay, in this particular context, you can make the call of, does it help you or not, right? And I think it's a good discussion to have. Well, we know we have locks on our doors. We know that if somebody is a good thief, that's not going to make any difference at all, but we still do it because it helps in a lot of cases. Maybe there's a similar discussion here, as long as it's cast as that kind of thing, right? Like, and can we work with that? Like, can our security model be, we provide this, but we don't consider it not working a vulnerability, right? Like, I don't know if that's a feasible thing, but that might be something that would probably be part of the discussion if we were supporting those kinds of things. Any other topics or things we should spend some of the time on? I don't know, Jean, if you're trying to say something. You showed up there, but we couldn't hear you.
Oh, no, nothing.
Okay. Okay, well, if not, then I think we've had a good discussion, and I think we've got some action priorities which we can document. And I would use this discussion to kind of like, if we do get some resources, to say here are some of the things as a project we've looked at that we'd want to do. Of course, we just have a small subset of collaborators here, so we'll write this down in a document, and other collaborators can comment and agree, disagree, and all that. But thanks for everybody's time and helping to go through and come up with something we can kind of document as a first pass of the strategy, and we can go from there. So thanks. With that, I will close out the call, and we'll hopefully see everybody in GitHub. Just before I go, I think it's worth mentioning that we do have another mini summit planned for OpenJS World, which is in June. We're hoping to do that in person. I assume we'll maybe can also have people come in remote as well, but we are planning to go into, let me find that. Issues. Right, I'm finding it. What we would like to go into there is technical deep dives on ESM and observability. So yeah, Vladimir, you talked about diagnostics. I think that's where we'll cover observability. ESM, I know there's lots of work going on in the project. The goal there is just to say, like, are we doing everything that we should be doing? Documented priorities, and maybe the ESM team will just say, yeah, here's the plan, it's all done, we won't have to do anything. But those are kind of like the two next highest priority ones we thought that we'd dive into. Also a good time to give a bit of a pitch for the Collaborator Summit. It's going to be the 2 days after OpenJS World. We're planning 2 days of node topics. There is in our summit repo information about submitting topics, so anybody can go in there, submit topics that we'd want to have collaborators talk about, and now is the time to start going in and submitting those, because we need to put that together in the next couple months. The next 10 team will be submitting the technical deep dives on ESM and observability. So don't necessarily need to do that, but for any other ones that you have in mind, or anybody who's watching the stream, please, think about that and submit those as well, because I'm looking forward to a good collaborator summit at that point. Otherwise, nice talking to everybody, and we'll see you in GitHub and hopefully at OpenJS World. Bye.